Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. I'm Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Now, if you're a regular follower of the podcast, you might have noticed that for the past few weeks, we were running a few weeks of replay episodes because recently I was taking some time off with my family. My 2.5-year-old daughter was off from daycare for a couple weeks, so we definitely wanted to take advantage of that and have some family adventures. We did some pretty fun things. We went to the aquarium, bunch of kids' play centers. We had some backyard fun. We got this new crazy hose / sprinkler that has like 15 wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube men that shoot water. If you watch Family Guy, you'll know what I mean by that. But we did that. We even went to this really cool zoo / wildlife sanctuary near us where we got to see some pretty cool animals that I've never seen before. We saw a white rhino, white lions, crazy stuff to see in person. But overall, just a really good time and nice to have a nice break. But this week, I was able to manage to get back at it, and I've got a really great interview lined up for you today. Today, I'm chatting with Ken Sluiter, who is a Grammy-nominated recording engineer, producer, mixer. He's worked with a wide range of artists, everyone from Weezer. He worked on the Red album. He's worked with Morrissey, James Blunt, Heart, OK Go, Jerry Lee Lewis, Flogging Molly, and a whole bunch more. And today we cover a lot of ground. We cover everything from building your career and also throughout that process, checking your ego so that you can spot opportunities for growth. We also get into Ken's processes for recording and mixing. We discuss working with bands like Weezer. And we also dive into Ken's workflow for things like setting up mixes, getting gain staging right, low end right, dealing with mix translation, and a ton more about that stuff as well. And I think Ken does a really great job of detailing his process and his mindset going into these things. So I think that there's a lot of really great stuff that you can take from this episode. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Ken Sluiter, thanks so much for being on the Master Mix podcast. How's it going today, man?
Good. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Of course. For people who might not be familiar with you and who you are, what you do, maybe some of the projects you've worked on or how you got into this industry, can you give us that background?
Sure. Yeah. Let me see. Well, I guess we'll start at the top. Well, how far back do you want to go, Mike?
As far as you want to go, yeah.
Yeah. I suppose this is sort of a cliched story, but I think that as a kid growing up, I was, addicted to radio. AM radio played the pop music when I was a kid, not so much FM. So I was just a AM radio junkie, sort of obsessed with my parents' record collection, my aunts and uncles when I would go over to somebody's house, like, when you're a kid and you would go over to some of your parents' friends' house, I would just go through their records and just listen and just devour everything. And it was a great time to fall in love with music. There was just so much good music happening. And yeah, I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in a small town outside of Joliet, Illinois. So like about an hour outside of Chicago. My dad had a guitar, played folk guitar a little bit. And so he taught me a couple of chord shapes. And I started taking lessons at like a local music store. It's funny, I started taking lessons with one teacher, and then when he said, we're going to move you on to the next guy who's more advanced, that next guy, I played left-handed, and when I started on the first day of lessons, he said, we're starting over. Restrung my guitar, and so in other words, my first few shapes, I played like McCartney or Elliot Easton, like left-handed guitar player, and he just said over the course of your life you'll just be so much happier if you just learn how to play right-handed. And so I started over, and it's funny, I look back at it and I think that guy, his name was Greg Carboni, and he taught guitar and piano lessons, and this was probably like the early 80s, 81 or 82, and he had just turned me on to like records that I really had no business listening to at that age, and it was sort of emerging post-punk, new wave, Blondie, The Pretenders, it was Roxy Music, all this stuff, and I was just a kid, and I think that at that age, you just sort of like everything. You just like music, like it's not a part of your identity yet, so it's not so much like when I got into high school, it was like the music that you listened to informed who you hung out with. Like a guy could be a nice guy, but if he was listening to metal and you were listening to punk or new wave, like you weren't going to be friends. But you would be friends with somebody who had the same taste in music as you, even if they were a total jerk. That's just the way it was back then. It was, and so that was that was sort of how I got going. And then I think that same teacher, as I had gotten a couple years into, guitar lessons, he had some synthesizers and started teaching me about synthesizers, and he had a 4-track cassette recorder, and so he showed me about that, taught me what overdubbing was, taught me how to, I bought like a little drum machine and programmed a drum machine, and he helped me figure out how to get my drum machine synced up with the built-in sequencer on my keyboard, and it just became, I fell in love with not just music, but the technology of music and making music, as we all do, right? We all have our own sort of origin story of the thing that sort of lights the fire, and that was it for me.
So getting into the production side of things, was the idea just to be able to record your own ideas, or did you ever see that as something that you could have turned into a career?
I didn't know what the career, I didn't know that there was an actual recording engineer job title, for example. But by that point, just looking back at it, I was, 15 years old. This is 1985, and I had drum machines and sequencers, and I had a Commodore 64 that ran a MIDI sequencing program, and I had a, some whatever I could find in the, we called them trading times, but the used, the recycle, they call it the recycler out here, but you just would look through the classified ads and find cheap pieces of gear, and I would mow lawns and, worked in a grocery store and just put all my money into whatever stuff I could afford. And I didn't really think about, it's funny, I didn't really think about doing it as a profession, but at the same time, I didn't really think about anything else. And I think that my folks, God bless them, my sister was a good student and I was not a good student. And they saw that I didn't have a talent towards music, but I had an interest towards music, and so they encouraged it. And then my senior year in high school, for Christmas, my parents bought me this book called The Beatles Recording Sessions, which I still have, and it was written by Mark Lewison, and it's a day by day, hour by hour journal report of every Beatles recording sessions. And that was right when CDs were coming out. We all grew up listening to the Beatles, but at that point, I was listening to the CDs while reading the book and just understanding the process was of making a record in the studio. And at that point, I knew that this is what I'm doing. I just never really looked back and never really considered doing anything else.
I love it, man. So then as far as so when that moment happened where you realize okay, this is the thing I want to do. There's other people doing this as a career. How did you then get started with that transition from this is a hobby to now I'm going to do this as something where I can work with others? Where did you get started with that?
Okay. Yeah, that's a couple things that happened right around that same time. I told you about my guitar teacher who taught me early on. And by high school, I was playing in a little band with this guy that I knew at a record store who had released an independent record, and he had played everything on his record. He just wanted to put a band together to do some shows to promote the record. And so I started out playing guitar in that band, and then we got a better guitar player, and so they moved me over to keyboards, and I didn't even know where middle C was. He taught me parts that I memorized, and I could play those parts as he taught me exactly. I couldn't improvise, couldn't, play around the chords, couldn't play through the changes, had no idea how it actually all worked. So this was happening right around the same time. And when it came time to start looking at colleges and stuff, I have 2 kids now in college, and the process of applying for colleges now versus what it was in the late 80s is very different. But I started looking around, and there was a few recording programs. One was good recording programs. One was University of Miami, which I knew I didn't have the grades for, and that wasn't happening. And I wasn't going to live that far away from school. There was Indiana University, which I was growing up in a small rural town in the Midwest. I wasn't interested in moving deeper into rural. I'm sure Indiana University is a very nice campus, but then there was Columbia College in Chicago, and that was about an hour away. And I was pretty immersed in, at the time, Chicago had a good sort of hardcore scene, which that wasn't particularly my cup of tea, but they also had a record label called Wax Trax, which was industrial dance music, which was a lot of drum machines, lots of programming, and I loved that I loved that stuff. So I was in Chicago quite as often as I could be anyway. So it just seemed like the natural progression to go to Columbia College. And so I went there and went through all, did my 4 years there, and then got an internship at a jingle studio. And in Chicago, the top level recording business was jingle based. That was the main client. And so this would have been like late 80s, early 90s. I went to college from like 88 to 92. And so I got an internship at a jingle studio, and it was right in the heart of this neighborhood called Streeterville. And at the time, I would say that there was probably in the neighborhood, all the ad agencies, all the jingle studios, and all the recording studios were in one neighborhood in Chicago, more or less. And there was probably 4 or 5 Neve VR rooms, probably 5 or 6 SSL rooms, like full-blown, built-out studios, in addition to lots of smaller production rooms and composer rooms. And so that was the studio world that I worked my way into. And at the time, there was also, and I'll get to that, there was also indie rock music was sort of emerging, and there was the recording studios in the neighborhoods of Chicago that were more designed for bands and rock record making. And I got into that as well. But when I first got to this jingle studio, this was January of 1992. Well, let me back up for a moment. My last semester of my senior year, the head of the department came to me and he said, we picked 4 kids that we just want to do this special program, and whatever credits you need to graduate, we'll just fill it in. And what they had going was the first 4 Pro Tool systems being shipped to Chicago were being shipped to Columbia College, and me and maybe 4 or 6 other guys just spent the semester unboxing them, plugging them in, figuring out how to make them work. So that was my first, and this was January of 92. So this was like, Mac 2CI and like a 4-channel Pro Tool system. And this is Pro Tools version 1.0. And at that time, actually, Pro Tools was 2 separate applications. It was Pro Deck and Pro Edit. Pro Deck was like the mixing part of it, and Pro Edit was the editing portion of it, in part because a different software company had actually built the software, but DigiDesign was like the hardware manufacturer, and they had sound tools and sample cells, so they had established themselves as a company, but I'd had some exposure to that. So when I started interning, and I'm working at this jingle studio, I come in and they have sound tools. They're running Studio Vision Pro. They have Sample Cell, which was a card that lived in the NuBus slot that was like a really high-end sampler, and just tons of MIDI synths all ready to go. There was a couple composers that were guys who had been around for a long time, traditional guys who had done, like everything from like furniture, like songs that you'd hear as a kid, like the traditional jingle, like Empire, 588-2300 Empire, that sort of thing. And then there was this younger guy, his name's Brian Rudy, and he's still out and he's still working, and he was really good keyboard player, really good producer, had really good ears, and could program and knew how to use all this stuff. And I think because him and I were, he was a few years older than me, but we were more or less the same age. He kind of took me under his wing and started showing me all this stuff. And at that point, it's this classic story, and this happens, I don't know if this happens anymore, but I showed up in the morning as the intern to make the coffee and get everything ready for the day, and we had like a noon downbeat session, and the engineer who was booked on the session had a morning session that was running over and called and said, I'm not going to make it to the session. And so my friend Brian, who I said, you're the engineer today. And so he just needed a body in the chair, just moving things forward. Like if I would go and press the wrong button on an auto locator, he would go over. Like he knew how to run the room. And so he was kind of my safety net. But we got through the day and it worked out fine. And so from then on, I basically went in and said, okay, well, I'm not interning anymore. Doing the session, I should be paid. And so they put me on staff, and then I worked for them for like a year on staff. And the funny thing is adjacent to that, one room had all this great technology and, state of the art at the time. And then they had a B room that was 3/4 inch tape machines and an 8-track machine. And that was like the voiceover, what we called the production room, where we do like voiceover and edits and stuff like that. And I basically spent a year bouncing back and forth between both of those rooms. So I would spend one day in a room with all this technology, and then I would go spend 3 or 4 days like cutting voiceovers and music edits with the razor blade and grease pencil and a stopwatch. So if you were recording a voiceover, for example, I've given this example a bunch of times, and say the voiceover needs to be 25 seconds, and then the producer like take 5, but it was 28 seconds, then we needed to pull 3 seconds out of that voiceover to make it work. So you start combing through the take, finding bits of error and chopping out little pieces of tape, and you put it on the table right next to you. And you knew at 15 IPS, 3 seconds was going to be, 45 inches of tape. And so you just keep cutting out error until you got, 45 inches of tape out there, and then you'd, press play, and it would time it, make sure it was right. And it had to sound right, and you had to be able to do it fast. And if you did it every day, you would get fast at doing it. And so I was able to have sort of that was like the last hurrah of that old way of doing things. And for, a couple of years, I was deeply immersed in the analog and digital side.
That's amazing. It's funny listening to like those old stories of like cutting the tape and thinking about the math behind it, all that. Like it makes you realize like how much we take for granted what we have now, right? So
well, it's funny because I remember eventually that studio bought 2 Pro Tools rigs, and we moved 1 Pro Tools rig into that B room, and I started cutting voiceovers right into Pro Tools, where an edit that would take 30 seconds now took 5 seconds. And we were going for a couple weeks, and it was moving along, and then the studio owner came, held a meeting, and he said, well, this is a problem because now like a 3-hour session's now an hour and a half session. And so we're like, well, what do I do? Should I slow down? And they're like, no, we can't slow down. And so we had to create like a new rate. We had an analog and a digital rate. But eventually, it didn't take long before it just all moved over to, all editing work was being done in the computer by 93 or 94, I would say.
That's hilarious. Like I always find that funny, even to this day, like when I see studios that advertise like per song rates versus per hour rates. And I always think like the people that are charging per hour, like they're doing themselves and their customers such a disservice to some degree, because it incentivizes people to work slow, and like you're not rewarded for efficiency and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think that's like a perfect example of just like how that kind of works even back in the day. So you were working in the jingle studio and you were doing all of this stuff. And then at some point you ended up assisting people like Andrew Scheps and Joe Ciccarelli and Jim Scott. How did that transition happen, or how did you get in the room with those people, and what was your experience like working with those people?
Sure. Well, so from there, simultaneously while I was, that studio was like a jingle studio by day and doing records and demos at night and on weekends. And so I was doing a bunch of that, and I was bringing in some bands and recording some bands in that studio. And so I started working for other studios out more in the neighborhoods. And in Chicago, by 94, Chicago was exploding with bands getting signed to labels. Chicago was really having a moment. And it was right in the heart of, Wicker Park, Rogers Park, this sort of, this where all the bands lived. So I started working there. I started working in that environment more. Eventually, I teamed up with a studio called Kingsize Sound Labs on the border of Wicker Park and Humboldt Park, I would say, out like on the west side of Chicago. And we just did records. We didn't do any ad work at all, just records. So did that for about 6 or 7 years. And then eventually, and I had met Joe through there because he was producing a record at my studio that I was a band that I was actually playing in at the time. So got to know him a little bit. And that moment I was describing that was happening in Chicago by 2000 or so, it was kind of over. And I'm not saying that like there's still at this moment there's a great music scene in Chicago and great bands and stuff like that, but the whole feeding frenzy of labels coming and giving people budgets, the budgets were just going away. And at that point, I'm in my early 30s. I was on the edge of getting married and realizing that I just didn't see, I felt like, not that I was like the top dude in town, because I wasn't the top dude in town, but I was busy enough to see like okay, this is what it is, and the bigger opportunities, they just are few fewer and farther between. I think I need to get into a larger market. And I think there was sort of a mass exodus of guys who were about my age that sort of said, if I want to keep working in the music business, I'm going to move to either Nashville or LA. And so that was like in the early 2000s. Moved to LA, was immediately told to try to find an assisting gig. And at that point I was like, no, I'm sort of building my producing career. I'd had a few producing credits and, produced a lot of indie records, but I thought to myself, that would be a huge step backwards for me to assist. And then about 2 years of just sort of scrambling to find any sort of work out in LA and just build up my contacts, I finally was like, okay, I'm going to start assisting. and I thought that I would do it to build up my network, to meet people and stuff. And then what ended up happening was that it ended up becoming like a master class for me. Like in Chicago, I had worked with a lot of people that I liked and admired, but I didn't really have a mentor-protege type of relationship. And then that started to happen for me out in LA. And I also sort of changed my attitude, and I said to myself, rather than focusing on the role that you want to play in a project, focus on the types of projects you want to work on and just be available and work in any role you can be. And so once I got my head around doing that, then the opportunity started coming and was able to, assist. I assisted Andrew on a Weezer record in 2007. Now, mind you, like this is, I'm assisting and I'm in my, mid 30s at this point, which actually isn't that unusual out here, but it felt very unusual to me at that time. But by that point, I think I had 2 kids, and I would have to I would bounce back and forth for several years, either assisting on projects or engineering and mixing other projects. And that's just what I had to do to sort of get into the stream of what was happening out here in LA. LA is a really big town with a lot of people working, but it does take a while to get your footing, I would say.
That it's such an interesting story, and I feel like even just on that note, there, like it's funny how ego can totally get in our way, right? It's like you got a little bit of experience, and you got this idea of like, this is what I am now, and I identify as an engineer. I'm not going to go down and be an assistant, that kind of thing. But it's funny how like you tell that story about it taking a couple of years, and then when you actually made that decision to go back and just like let it happen the way it could happen, like see what happens. It's funny how that ended up being like a really pivotal lesson, and you learned a ton of good stuff from that.
And there are those opportunities. In many ways, like sometimes I feel like my career has been slightly Benjamin Button style, meaning where it's all the right things, but in the wrong order. For example, early in my career, like I went right into doing sessions all the time, and I didn't even really assist that much. In other words, I went from being an intern to being an engineer and didn't really assist, never had to align tape machines, never had to do any of the sort of like, daily maintenance that you would have to do. Well, when I became a partner, the one studio I became part owner of, and as the owner, we were responsible for aligning the tape machines and doing different tape types. If I rented the room to another engineer, I would align the tape machine, make sure it would get going. So I did eventually have to learn that. And then I get into my 30s, at this point, still had never assisted for anyone. And suddenly it's like, well, you don't get through this business without having to do it. So just, dig in. And it was just fascinating to watch how other people work, or watch how other people get to the same, one engineer might get to the finish line and have the results sound very similar to another engineer, but the way they did it might have been totally different, and you just see that like this engineer cares very much about this, but doesn't care about that at all. And then you meet another engineer who cares about, the opposite, the inverse. And it's all that matters is what's coming out of the speakers, and what's working for the artist and the artist and the label, making sure that they're happy.
Of course. So then, having worked for those people and seen the differences in their processes, what would you say were some of the best habits or mixing approaches that you picked up on from working with those people?
Okay, well, when I was working on the Weezer record with Andrew, that was the first, and this isn't. I think this is the environment he came up working with. And there's a certain type of record that you make where the goal is just to. The answer is yes before you've even heard what the question is. Meaning, like you are there to provide like an engineer I was used to an engineer being more of like a part of the creative team of a record, and there's a lot to it. But when you're engineering for when you're the lead engineer, the first engineer for a big project, your fundamental job is just to provide the resource for the band to make anything happen the way they need to make it happen. So on that particular project, I think we were recording something like 50 plus like tracks off of the floor, and we would just stay and record even on tracks that weren't plugged into anything, because you never know like when suddenly somebody's going to say, hey, why don't we just play that part on a farfisa? Well, the artists might be over playing the farfisa, like put their guitar down and go over to the organ and start playing. But you can't stop recording, create a new track and label that new track. That track has to be ready to go, has to be in record all the time. And anytime the band was playing, we were recording and taking notes and making sure that we were on top of everything that was happening. And sometimes, a musician would want to do an overdub, but we hadn't picked the final take yet. So they just do the overdub across the 3 takes that were considered the best. Now, in my indie rock world of being like super efficient, I'd be like, wait a minute, let's take the time to figure out like which take is going to be the final take, and then we'll build on top of that. But that's not your call to make. That's the band's call to make. And if they're not ready to pick the take yet, but they want to do overdubs, then we're not gonna always do the most efficient thing. We're gonna do what keeps the flow going for the band. And Andrew was very good at that, and very good at like not getting flustered over anything or any request. I think we had 2 drum kits set up in mic, and that would be another thing. Like you would just, those tracks would just stay and record. It didn't matter. We'll buy more hard drives. We have the resources here. And that was really eye-opening for me, and for example, I mean, even just in a different way of working is that with some projects, you're recording a band, say, to a click track, or maybe to even pre-recorded tracks or whatever. So every take is a new playlist, right? Like, okay, take 1. Okay, we're going to do another take, flip the playlist over, take 2, and you move on. And that's the right way to work for some projects. For some projects with bands who are not playing to a click track, or who just want to go and you just literally need to record every moment, you just press record and you just keep rolling. And so if take 10 is the take, that take might be like, an hour and a half into the session, and that's where you work. And you keep all the other takes there for spare parts. You hit that clam on that chord, but I know that we did it on the earlier take, and you just grab it. So it's not only a different way of recording, but it's a different way of editing,
That's so interesting. I imagine that would be really helpful when you're in that like kind of pre-production stage as well, where like people are trying new ideas on the fly and people are jamming out ideas like really quickly. You can grab that stuff and use it. And if they're to a click, then that makes it even easier to edit it, right?
Well, and that's the other thing too, is just because things aren't to a click doesn't mean that you can't edit them as well. That's was the other. I mean, and we could get into all the shenanigans of tempo mapping and editing and ticks versus samples and we could really go down the rabbit hole of how to make that happen. But the point is that if it feels better without a click, and if the band's more comfortable recording out a click, then that's the way you do it.
For sure. Well, that's also interesting too, because like you've worked with a wide range of artists, different genres, different levels of success in their careers. And so I was curious to ask about like how that impacted your approach to production. And as far as like, you gave that example of Weezer and how Andrew likes to work, but like, how do you generally gauge the way a band should work, or like what the best process is for a band when they come to you, or an artist? Because I'm imagining like you have your own process that you're kind of instinctively wanting to do, but then when a band comes in, you kind of see how they work, and maybe you have to adjust things. So as far as like adjusting your process, like what does that typically look like when you're working with different genres or different levels of artistry?
Sure. I mean, well, I think that a lot of it depends on what my role is. If I'm the engineer, then and I'm not the producer, then it's really not my place to say how we're going to do things. They tell me how they want it done, and then I figure out a way to do it. If I'm producing, and again, even if I'm producing, it kind of depends on if it's a band's first record, if I'm the one with the most experience in the room, then I'm going to, try to do it my way as much as possible. If I'm working with a band that's very established and they've done a lot of records, then I have to work the way they like to work. A lot of times I'll try to just have a conversation. I'll say, this is how I like to do it. How do you like to do it? Let's figure out some way that we can both get what we want. What worked on the previous project might not work on this next one. Some bands want to just play like it's a rehearsal, and you just get them really good mixes in their headphones, and you don't impose a click track on them, and you just let them do their thing. And then some bands are they want to get into what they want to get into what I'm doing and what microphone are you using on the kick drum, and honestly, I have to say that I've had better luck with artists who don't care at all about the audio side of it. In other words, you think, okay, these guys are very, these guys have tape op and they're reading and they know what's going on with all this stuff. Great. Now we're all going to have all this knowledge, but what ends up happening is sometimes we end up canceling each other out, and I've seen that more often than not. And then somebody comes along and they're like, I don't care at all about how you do it. Usually that's the projects that I like, and they turn out great.
That makes sense. So then with artists that have had like a successful career and maybe are known for a specific kind of tone or sound, when it comes to the sonics of a record and engineering, like how much of a role does that previous history play in your decisions as an engineer?
It's a good question. It's funny that you would ask that, because I feel that on the occasions when I've worked with bands that have a known sound that everybody knows, I think that you instinctively just push the faders into that sound and you make it sound that way. You can't help it. There's so often I've heard like I think about a band I love. Like I think that like a band that makes really great records, and I think about how much I would like to work with that band, and I think, well, but I wouldn't have anything to offer. What perks up my ear more is if I hear an artist that has something going on, that intangible thing, but needs a little bit of help, is a little rough around the edges. Then it's like, okay, now I know what to do. But if I was recording, Radiohead's not going to come to me saying, how do you think we should sound? I'd say you just keep doing what you've been doing your entire career, because it's the best, But yeah, on those occasions where I'm working with a band that has a sound, it's happening before it even hits the microphone. That's the one thing that I have learned is so much of it has to do with just the artist, with their fingers, with their sensibilities, what keys they gravitate towards, all that stuff. And maybe you can do, have your own little spin on it here and there, but in general, the idea is to make that artist sound like themselves, and if they want to diverge from what they've done, then you can help them do that as well, and sometimes that's hard to do. Sometimes I don't like that as much. I've worked with bands that want to go into a new direction as we're doing it. I'm like, this isn't as special as what you like. Is there a way that we can keep what you had and then just push it forward a little bit? Maybe this is too far. I don't know.
Yeah, I imagine that that's a little bit of a difficult topic too, because like when you get a band that wants to grow their sound and evolve, when you as a fan of that artist know them for a specific sound, like there's got to be that little bit of push and pull to like, preserve what really like the fans want versus what maybe the artist's ego wants or whatever, right?
Sure, yeah. And you have to find a happy medium, but without compromising, because compromising is, nobody wants to hear something compromised. That's a failure, So you have to give the audience what they want, you have to give the band what they want, and you have to give the label what they want. So you have three entities to please, and so there's not a lot of room for what you want. I will say that as far as if you're producing a solo artist or a singer-songwriter, there seems to be a lot more leeway, because you can, like hiring the musicians is like casting like actors for a play. You can say, like, I think that with this different drummer and different rhythm section, I think right from the get-go we're going to have a different sound. And singers seem to be more, you can change the sound more drastically from album to album, whereas a band, it's the band, and they have a certain, the one thing I will say, and this is now I'm getting into some like, old man, get off my lawn type stuff. But part of a band's sound is how that band feels when they're playing together, and their natural pocket that happens. And it's part of it is their feel and their timing, Part of it is their tuning, meaning, sometimes you have like a chemistry between two guitar players where one guy's a really good guitar player and the other guy doesn't have maybe the chops, but has like a lot of the feel, or can do like all the super vibey stuff. And if you take a band that has this like really identical pocket and then you push them all to a grid, it might sound good and it might sound more contemporary, but it's not going to sound like that band as much. And now that's been going on for so long that now there's when something like a Jack White track comes on the radio, or something that wasn't cut to a grid, it really jumps out of the speakers sounding special because you still have a pocket intact. And it's like, oh, this feel kind of sound like the White Stripes, for example. Meg White isn't really winning any drumming awards yet. I can't think of a band that reminds me more of Led Zeppelin than some White Stripes tracks. And how can that be? Led Zeppelin has the greatest rock drummer it's because it's the feel of it and it's the way it feels. And so if you want, you can't just edit a band to a grid just to make your editing life easier down the road. And that said, sometimes that is the sound of the band, and sometimes they want that, but you have to know when to do it and when not to do it. And if you need the editing flexibility that a grid offers you, then you have to build the grid based on the band, which takes a little bit longer, but it can still be done. And sometimes a band will want you to do all that stuff, but they don't want to talk about it or hear about it. And so you do it, and my thing is like, I do my thing, and if somebody doesn't like it and they tell me, I don't like that, then all right, well, then we'll do something else. It's the same thing with mixing. When I'm mixing, I do what I feel like I need to do to make this thing sound like a finished record that I would want to listen to. And every now and then someone will say, I don't dig that thing that you did, and it's okay, then we'll try it another way.
Fair. Yeah, makes sense. Well, we talked a lot about your role as an engineer, especially in the recording process, but I do want to talk a little bit about your mixing process as well and some of your techniques there. And one of the first questions that I had about the mixing side of things, a bit of a technical one, but I actually heard you on another podcast talking about how you like to mix 100% in the box. I don't know if that's still the case, but one of the things you mentioned in that interview that I thought was interesting was that you talked about doing that because mixing hybrid or going out to any analog gear could cause clocking issues. And I was curious to know, like, is that your reason for sticking 100% in the box?
There's a lot of reasons for sticking 100% in the box. And the one thing I'll say is, like, that's what works for me. And so if somebody's out there and they are mixing traditionally, meaning like building a mix on faders on a console, or summing through building the mix in Pro Tools and then summing it, if that's what works for somebody and they're having success, then you stick with what's working for you. For me, I find so many advantages to mixing in the box. The clocking thing it's really hard to explain, and I feel like it's very misunderstood. But, well, first of all, I think that the converters and the clocks in the more recent interfaces are much better than they were, say, 10 years ago. So all this stuff is becoming less and less of an issue. But my point being is in the age, if you were to go back, say, 10 years, like 2015 or so, and the way people were thinking about how to incorporate in the box mixing, if you're the kind of person who wants to use like a super, like a atomic clock or a super high-end clock, and you're recording your record through that clock, so that's the clock that you recorded your record through. Now, if you go mix in another studio, or if you send your tracks to another mixer, and that mixer's mixing with any sort of analog, whether it be analog inserts in Pro Tools or whether it be an entirely analog sort of setup, now that's a second clock that is being clocked off of. So now you have two clocks. So already the benefits that you got from recording with a high-end clock, they're not wiped out, but you're not getting the same benefit. Whereas when you're mixing 100% in the box, those files are still were recorded on that clock, and the clock that the clock that's driving what you're hearing is only affecting your playback. But if you're printing that track in Pro Tools, you're still dealing with one clock. And so if you wanted to go down that rabbit hole of like becoming super anal about what kind of clocking you're using, then that would be a better way to go. That's my case. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, like as you're switching up clocks, it's kind of messing with the fidelity of everything. So I understand that. I guess maybe a question I should have asked to preface that other one is for people who don't understand what clocks are. Like how does that actually impact the quality of the sound?
I think that probably the biggest tell for like a good clock versus a bad clock is stereo imaging. The better the clock, the wider something sounds. And if you have an oscilloscope or a phase scope, you can see things like actually move depending on what clock you're clocking it on. I feel like that's the biggest tell. And what we thought was a good clock 20 years ago, now everyone the other thing I'll say too is that sometimes you have to have an external clock because you have multiple devices, you have multiple interfaces. Like when I first moved to LA, it was everyone had a bunch of 192s all clocked to an Apogee Big Ben. That was like the gold standard for how you would do it. And then Dan Lavery, who does Lavery converters, wrote this paper saying, if you only have one interface, you shouldn't clock that to something else. You should just clock it to whatever, the best clocking scenario is one interface with its own internal clock. If you daisy chain a bunch of interfaces together, that's a slightly different sound. Some people are really anal about it. Some people don't worry about it at all. And it's just a matter of how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go with that stuff. But that's just one of several arguments I have for why I like in-the-box mixing. I mean, the more important argument I'll make is that I just feel like the plugins sound so good now, and they're just getting better and better. And so every time I pull up like a 480L plugin in my house and hear that sound, I just can't believe it. To this day, that's so exciting to me that I have that sort of functionality in my house, and I don't see why you wouldn't do it. So I just made a decision at one point, I'm moving on. This is the way I'm doing things because this is what I like. And I know a lot of people will say, like I've seen things where people are like, don't look at the screen when you're mixing. Man, I look at the screen like crazy when I'm mixing. I don't care. I don't think it's negatively affects what I'm doing. I want to be as involved with the audio files as I can be. I love it. Every day I walk into my little home studio here and fire up my rig. I can't believe how powerful my tools are.
For sure. Yeah. The technology is it's crazy how good plugins are sounding these days. And I think it's really reassuring for people listening to this. Like a lot of people might not have either the luxury of having access to fancy clocking and outboard or whatever, or maybe they're still in that gear lust phase of like, I need the best of the best. So, but I think it's reassuring to hear you talk about how just like sometimes just keeping it simple with one interface that is going to get you better results, and that the quality of all of that stuff is at such a high level these days that you don't have to worry about all of that stuff. So yeah, I think that's reassuring there. As far as your mixing process goes, how do you typically approach a new mix? Like, what are you listening for? Do you have like a similar process that you always follow with your mixes? What does that look like?
I would say, the only thing that's really changed about my mixing over the years is that back when I worked up with the console, is that every mix started with all the faders down, and then you'd build your mix like from the get-go. And I had a little formula for that. I would turn one thing I tell people is the first thing you do is you turn your control room volume, whack it right up, like really loud. Not so you're listening loud. Well, I mean, for the first 15, 20 minutes while I'm getting a rhythm section, I'm usually lighting the room up pretty loud. But if you don't have your control room volume up, then you're going to do fader creep. You're going to have all your faders up higher than they need to be, and then you're going to be constantly trying to trim your mix back as you're adding things into the mix. So the best way to fix that right off the bat for me is, like, my little formula is turn the control room volume up really loud, push the kick drum up till it's like at minus, like -7 or -8, turn up the bass until that's now at -5, and then start blending everything to that. And then you should have a mix that breathes because you're hitting the 0 VU mark. You're not slamming your mix processing, and just go do it. These days, what I try to do is I get the rough mix, and the first thing I try to do is match the rough mix. And then save that as a session. So that way I know, like, the rough mix was where this song was at when they thought this thing's done and ready to be mixed. So it's important to reference that. And you have to do the thing where you have to beat that mix on every measure, but remember what was making that mix work and make sure that it's still working in what you do. So now I don't really start with all my faders down. I start with the faders and the plugins, like, as I get them. If I want to EQ, I mean, this is seems a little bit counterintuitive, but like, if say I want to brighten up the snare drum, I don't go look at the EQ that they put there and then brighten up their EQ. I just add my EQ after it and then brighten that snare drum up. Because as far as I'm concerned, all those plugins as they came into me, I'm just going to leave those be. I'm not going to change any of those. And if they're making something brighter and then I'm making it less bright, and somebody could go through and like audit my plugins, they'd be like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. This one plugin is turning it up and this one's turning it down. I don't care about any of that. I'm just going for, like, this is the way I like to do things. And even though I have a zillion plugins, I use a dozen of them regularly. I have my little go-to, settings and sounds that I like to use, and I use them, and that has nothing to do with genre at all. Like, mostly I work with, like, rock music, singer-songwriter music. I don't get the calls to do much hip-hop or the sort of hyper-pop or whatever's happening now. But on the rare occasions where I do anything that sort of is in that vibe, I don't really change the plugins I use. I don't really change my approach. I just try to mix it and until it sounds, I just work at it until it sounds like it's not something that I'm working on anymore. When it starts sounding like something that I'm just listening to, when I start feeling detached from it in a good way, like I'm not involved in it, that's when I start feeling like, hey, I think this thing's ready to send to the artist. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, there's a few interesting things that you said there that I just kind of want to, like, point out for people listening. Like, I number one, just on the topic of listening at louder levels, I love that approach, because it's forcing you to just, like, listen, getting things to a comfortable level in your room where, yes, your monitors are louder, but it's now comfortable. You're not focused on the meters at that point. It's just like, what's tolerable to my ears at that point. And I think that's great, because that definitely leaves a lot of headroom, which is definitely a thing that I find a lot of people make mistakes with. They focus on the meters so much, or they just turn everything up because their monitors are low, and then they end up with a mix that has no headroom and everything starts distorting and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's a great tip that you gave there. And then as far as you mentioned, like, doing like -8 with the kick and then -5, I think you said, with the bass, like, that definitely seems like a great approach for situations where you don't have maybe a rough mix to go off of. And that's actually something that I've always done in my own mixes too. And I think I picked that up from, like, Jakir King or something like that. But it's a really cool approach with the rough mixes. So you're literally taking people's, like, raw Pro Tools sessions or whatever they've done with their sessions, and you're working off of that then, right?
Often, yeah. I mean, if something comes to me and it has a zillion plugins on it, I might go tell the producer or the artist, hey, print all this as stems and just give me the lead vocal dry, and or maybe the snare drum, don't print the reverb on it or something like that. But if somebody has, if a lot of the production is, well, for example, like I never really assisted for Joe Ciccarelli. He just would hire me to mix on projects with him. And there's a lot of things that he would do, like a lot of the production techniques and stuff he would do, that he would do it on his own and then print it to 2 tracks. So sometimes I would get a mix and I'd be like, oh, the entire drum kit's on 1 track. He didn't record it onto 1 track. It's just he got something where he liked it and he printed it. Or there'll be some, crazy effects on a guitar solo or something. He doesn't send me, like, a Pro Tools sessions with a dozen plugins making that sound. He got that sound and then committed it to 2 tracks, and I didn't have to worry about it. I don't know how he made it. It was done, and it was presented to me. So that's. Wait, I don't know if I'm answering. Now I'm not sure what your question was. I'm not sure which question I was answering. I mean, in other words, I try to build on top of whatever it is that they've already done. I try to not undo what somebody's, unless something's just like a disaster. And sometimes that happens, where I'll see something that's like from like an emerging artist or emerging producer, and I'm like, they saw something on the internet that told them to do this, but this isn't the type of song you want to do this on, so we're gonna rethink this, we're gonna redo that. But I generally try to just work with what I'm given
Fair. Well, I've even heard you talk about how in the recording stage you like to commit to things as much as possible. So I think taking a similar approach, if someone gives you something that is presented a certain way, like that's the assumption of like, this is what they want it to sound like. Let's just commit to this basically and build off of this. So that definitely makes a lot of sense there. As far as like your workflow, so once you've got that rough mix up, do you typically kind of have a standard way of working as far as like working on specific instruments in a specific order, or like how do you approach that process of determining what to do next, and ultimately knowing like when you're done with it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as we were talking about like building the headroom into the mix, what I do try to do is, whether I'm starting with faders down or just opening up as I see it, is I try to get a rough balance of all the elements that are going to add energy to the song. Meaning, like, I might not worry about the tambourine or like the little percussion bits, but the core rhythm section of the song, the engine of the song. Yeah, I try to get all that stuff so I have my headroom in order. And then from there, I'll mute everything but say that, well, the one thing I will do is I'll go and I'll fix any big problems before I really get into mixing. So if there's like crazy sibilance on the voice, or, you know, insane like bleed on the toms or whatever, I might go clean all that stuff up before, just as sort of a you know, the prep work. Get it all organized, make sure that, you know, sometimes people will have the track so it's like, wait a minute, this one vocal line on the third harmony vocal is actually the melody, and so that needs to get put onto the lead. You know, so I might go reorganize the track so it all makes sense to me. So I'll do all that, and then get my rough mix together to get my headroom, and then I'll usually just focus on the drums for a little bit. Try not to spend too much time on any of it, and I'll usually do drums, then I'll mix the drums and bass together, and then I'll do the lead vocal. Like, for whatever reason, I go right to the lead. I used to go drums, bass, guitar, keyboards, lead vocal, but I found that it just, you got to always have the vocal in there. And so what I'll do is I'll do drums, bass, lead vocal, and then I'll start filling in the guitar and keyboards. And I don't spend a lot of time with the vocal muted. I probably should spend more time with it muted, because I'll tell you, sometimes when I'm printing the instrumental mix of a mix that's approved, I'll hear something that's just like, I should have caught that. Like, how did I not catch that? And it's like, well, you didn't catch it because it was under the lead vocal and you didn't notice. But in general, like, the lead vocal is sort of always the main thing that matters, so that I try to keep that in there all the time to make sure that everything is supporting that top line and that melody.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Like, you're focusing on just, the most important elements of a track. And then, I mean, it kind of goes to show that, like, maybe sometimes having that, like, very micro approach to, like, working on a mix where you're listening to all of the details of an instrumental, some of that might not even matter when you have, like, the main elements, like a vocal in the forefront where people need to hear it anyway. So, there's something to be said for just, like, listening to everything in context and seeing how it really fits together, and what is an actual issue to focus on versus what can you leave in a mix, right?
Yeah, for sure. And then once I kind of get it all happening where I think it sounds good, I really try to like listen to it, imagining I'm the artist, and like thinking it like how they're going to react to it. And if say, for example, if the artist is on tour and I know that they're going to be listening to this on AirBuds, then I'll listen to it on AirBuds before I send it, because I might catch a couple little things, And we were talking about monitoring loud a few minutes ago. There's also this thing that happens where, say, for example, it's like, okay, I like this mix. This is good. I'm ready to send the first pass to the client. And so I put the track and record, and I hit dim, and so I can so I can hear a little bit of music happening, and then I'm checking my email or doing whatever. I'm not paying attention to the music. Inevitably, I get halfway through the track and something pokes out. Even though it's like you can barely hear it, something pokes out, and I'm like, wait, what was that? Stop, and then I go listen, and I'm like, let me fix that. So, listening loud can reveal a lot, but listening like almost painfully quiet can reveal quite a bit too, especially when it comes to vocal blends and like S's and T's that stick out unmusically. You're going to hear all that when you're just listening really quiet. Or sometimes you might even hear an edit that you didn't hear loud. You might hear a bad edit, and then suddenly it's super quiet, or you're listening on a super small set of speakers, and that edit is just as loud as it can be. And so, it is that said, I'm not the kind of guy who likes to listen on a billion different systems. Like, you see the guys who have like 5 sets of near field monitors, and they're like, you're never going to get your mix to sound great on every monitor. It's just not going to happen. So in my mind, I try to make them sound great on the 2 references I have, and I need to make sure that they work on everything else. They're not going to sound great on everything else. That's just not going to happen.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up. Like, translation doesn't mean your mix sounds identical. It's translation is making a mix sound the way it should on those speakers. So you have to really understand those speakers first.
And what that means to me, what the biggest part about that is part of it's like vocal level, because it's the classic battle of mixing is and has always been that if the vocal's not loud enough, then you can't hear the vocal and you can't understand the words. If the vocal's too loud, it makes the band small. So you have to find that spot where you can, maybe if you can't understand all the words, it still feels like you could if you wanted to, but the band can't sound small. So it all has to be happening in that right area. And then the other thing on smaller speakers is I want to make sure that I can hear the chord. So say, for example, if your bass tone is like a synth bass or like a 5-string bass, and that bass part is written so low that you can't hear it on speakers at all, and then it sounds like the singer's like in outer space and no one's playing, you don't hear the root isn't in the guitar chord or something, then you have to figure out a way to take that bass, and you could either sometimes like slightly distorting it. And when I say distorting it, I don't mean like a 9-inch nails distortion. I mean like distortion that you would never hear as distortion, but then that helps you hear that bass note on a smaller set of speakers. But more importantly, now we can hear the chord of the song, so we can understand like what the melody line really is doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's one of the things I find myself doing. I've got a little mix cube, and I find that when it comes to bass especially, that's definitely one of the things I'm listening for. Like, if I can't hear any bass at all, I know that there's a problem. I got to incorporate a little bit of that saturation and whatever to get it to stand out. And it's funny too, it's like when you listen to a bass in solo that sounds good on a mix cube, it might sound extreme. Like, sometimes the saturation can sound like almost unbearably loud and distracting, but it's like when you listen in context, it all works. And now it fits on that speaker, and it translates better to lots of different speakers. So yeah, I think it just really is it's a good argument for, again, just listening in context with everything and understanding, that translation side of things.
Yeah. Because the main thing is you just have to, with all these things, you just have to, I just always think is like, is it musical or is it unmusical? It's like, am I going to distort something because that's what everyone's doing these days? Or am I going to distort it because I think that that's what it needs to speak, to find its place in the mix? And honestly, for me, like a little bit goes a long way in that department. Like, I think that there's whole eras of records where people were so focused on distorting drums that now when you listen to them, they don't stand the test of time, and you're just like, God, that was a thing then, but now I really don't like listening to it, And so I do try to, as an artist and as a producer, whatever, like, you want to make a record that sounds contemporary, but you don't want to make it so it sounds like it's like going to be dated in 2 years, and that's hard to do. I mean, with today's pop music, I'll hear a song. I'm a sucker. I have, my friends tell me I have like the taste of like a 14-year-old girl when it comes to pop music. In other words, whatever is the new thing, I'm excited about it too, just as much as everybody else. But then I'll listen to it 3 or 4 years later, and I'm like, why did I like that track? This is kind of a stupid song, But whereas the pop music when I was a kid, it's Tears for Fears is timeless. You know what I mean? Like, those songs are so well produced that even though they were of their time, it's not a joke to listen to them now, whereas a lot of music, you play it like ironically, and I don't think any artist wants their music to be played 10 years from now, like as a joke, as like, oh, isn't this ridiculous, this reverb we used on this snare, that kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's always that balance of like following trends in the genre and getting like the vibe of the genre versus just getting something that captures the essence of the band in the cleanest way. I was recently in a conversation with a bunch of mastering engineers in my area, and someone had brought up the idea of like, he was like, is everyone else finding that like we're never adding any sort of saturation in mastering like we used to back in the day, but now everyone has so much saturation in their mixes that there's like, I wish we could take it out of masters, like, and it was really interesting. And, I think we all kind of came to the conclusion that like, I think so many people these days think that saturation is this thing that you need to have in mixes. And so many genres are also sonically in that direction, especially in a lot of rock stuff where like people are just pushing a lot of drive on the drums and that kind of stuff. And it definitely can date certain sounds. Like, I'm sure 10 years from now we'll be like, oh, we really overdid it with all that saturation on that stuff.
Yeah, and my experience is that it makes it harder to make the master louder when you have so much distortion in something. It really gets painful to listen to when you add 4 dB of gain reduction on a limiter, like on a peak limiter, on something that's when there's distortion on cymbals and hi-hats and stuff. That's a rough that's kind of hard to listen to, I find. And it's funny that also makes me think about how just different perspectives is that when I was mixing in the 90s, when it was tape machines and tape machines, some Pro Tools, some ADATs and D88s or whatever, but in general what you were trying to do is you were trying to create separations. In other words, everything was in a cloud and you tried to decloud the mix by creating as much clarity and separation as you can amongst the instruments. Now it's all about gluing all the instruments together. Everyone's really focused on the opposite of separation. They're trying to make sure that everything sounds like it's kind of coming from one box. And there's ways you can do that. Having a different reverb for every instrument is not a good way to gel things together. Sometimes having one reverb that is used for the drums, for the vocals, for everything, having one parallel compressor that's on the kick, snare, lead vocal, and bass guitar, like blended in, is usually the thing that kind of helps things like make sense together.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you kind of brought up drums a little bit, and one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is that when I listen to a lot of the projects that you've worked on, especially artists like Classes Act or US Girls or the Licorice Quartet, those kind of bands, one of the things that stood out to me in those tracks was that you do an awesome job of getting these like really big, boomy, massive, beefy kick drums, but you do it in a way where it's not muddy in a mix. Like it has tons of feel, tons of thump, and it's powerful, but yeah, without all that mud. So I was curious to ask about that. Being a drummer myself, I guess I get really nerdy when it comes to drum stuff. But yeah, I'm curious to know, like, what's your secret for getting kick drums to have that definition and body in a mix?
Well, let me see. With a lot of those things that you just asked, like Classless Act, Joe Ciccarelli produced that, so I wasn't involved in the recording side of it. I mean, when you get sent a Joe Ciccarelli production, first of all, it's like you have to beat the rough mix, and the rough mix usually sounds like a record, like it's so you go, and he gets very good drum sounds. I don't really know how he does it. I can only really speak for myself, and I care about like how long is the kick drum? Is it going to be a short little thump thump? Or is it going to be like a boom, boom? And if it's going to be a boom and resonate and ring out, it doesn't need to be in the tonic of the key of the song, but it can't be like a half step off. It has to be musically related to it. And if it's not, then you have to shorten the attack of it. So it's just this short little thing happening. I think that a lot of times, just conceptually for myself, I usually try to kind of carve a hole out like at 160 to 250. Like I just completely dump out because that's where the bass lives. So you have the kick drum has all the super low end, but then it has to have the knock above it, and in between that is the fundamental note of the song. And so like when I'm doing stems, I'll be like, wow, I really scooped out that kick drum. Like that kick drum on its own sounds too EQ'd. But then in the mix, it makes sense and it tends to work. But I try to make sure that the kick drum is across any genre that I know of, the kick drum needs to move the air in the room. And so you want to make sure that that's happening, that whatever it is you're doing, whether it's EQing the existing kick drum or blending in a sample. Well, and the funny thing is I will say that often with samples, with kick and snare samples, for example, a snare sample will usually be blended into the snare drum, usually underneath the snare drum to give it a little bit more crack and stuff. Kick drum samples, sometimes you can blend them together. Sometimes you just say, no, we're just using the sample on this, because just low end doesn't blend the same way as snares do, but you look and you say, what does this kick drum not have? Then I'm going to add that on the sample, and sometimes what it doesn't have is tone, sometimes what it doesn't have is punch. And so I have, like my 5 kick drum samples that I use, and those I might try to blend it in. But again, if it comes into 2 notes rubbing and they start beating together, then you have to pick, okay, I have to either use just the sample for the kick drum, or I'm not going to use a sample at all, and I'll figure out some other way to get the kick drum to punch the way it needs to. And sometimes that's creating a parallel track to it that's gated and compressed, and you blend that in so it's the same sound but just punchier, and yeah, those are usually the go-tos.
When you talk about like shortening up the sustain of a kick drum, are you using things like transient designers for that, or are you relying more on compression? What does that look like?
Usually a gate. Usually a gate. And the thing about gates is that gates don't need to go to silence in between the notes. In other words, if you're knocking off 3 or 4 dB off the release of a track, that can shape a drum track quite a bit. So nobody wants to hear a gate chattering. So you got to know, like, okay, I'm getting my threshold for my gate, so only the kick drum's opening it up. So you might have that range turned all the way so it goes to silence while you're dialing it in. But then once you put it in the mix, say, okay, how much noise gating do I really need to do here? And sometimes it's not that much. You got to make sure that whatever you're doing is musical. I know some guys, they'll side chain the bass to the kick drum and all that stuff, and I have not had luck with that. That doesn't work for me. I will try it again sometime, but those things, those mix tips, just for whatever reason, just don't work out. And that said, some of that had to do with, for the longest time, Pro Tools didn't compensate for the sidechain latency. So when you try to do that stuff in Pro Tools, it just sounded really clumsy. So I might have to revisit that and see if there's good ways to do that, but it doesn't really come up in my world too much.
Fair enough. As far as that relationship between kick and bass, you talked about how with the kick, you'll often cut around like the 160 area to make room for the bass. Do you find that you're doing like complementary style EQ with the bass in the lower end, like, 60, 80 or something like that, just to make more room for that thump of the kick? Or is it something you don't really have to worry about too often?
Sometimes, usually when I'm cutting like sub low end out of the bass guitar, well, first of all, I don't take low end out of anything by default. In other words, if I'm taking low end out of something, it's because I'm trying to fix a problem. Say for example, if the song is in C and the bass player is playing C on the second string, but then the low E is rumbling, like because it just they don't have great technique, I might have to deal with that. So I might go put a high pass filter and you spend a few minutes making sure that you still got, bass guitar still needs to move air, not unlike a kick drum, but you can't have a note that's ringing that's out of the key of the song. So I'll do that. But in general, I try not to. I try to let it roll for as much as I can. I find sometimes boosting like a shelf at 200, it sounds really good on bass. Maybe my starting point will be like plus 3 dB at 200, just pushing up the entire low end of it a little bit. Maybe sometimes boosting a little 700 or 800 if you want it to be more like a Rickenbacker and sort of speak, if it's a really melodic bass line that functions melodically, which is, people don't think of bass is often like the second most melodic instrument in a track behind the lead vocal, like especially like with Licorice Quartet. That stuff is all very, McCartney influenced, and so that stuff we want to make sure we speak. So I remember on that, like I need to boost 6 dB at 700, so I need to find the EQ that's going to do that the best, and that's not an unusual thing for me to do.
So then how do you ultimately know when you're done with the mix? The hardest question to answer.
It is. I mean, some of it's like you could keep tweaking on and on, so there's mostly deadlines, but it is that thing when it starts feeling like it's not a mix I'm working on, but a record I'm listening to, then I try to at that point, send off the first pass, and I try to make my first pass be, like some people will send a first pass and they haven't really finished mixing it yet, but they feel like, oh, I need to get the artist more involved, sooner. And occasionally that is true. Occasionally it's like, I don't know which direction to go in this. This is where I'm at now. Let's play it for the artist. But 9 times out of 10, what I send as my first pass is, this is what I think you should put on your record. Now, it's not my record, so I know we're going to make changes and we're going to shift this to your taste, but this is what I would do, And so I try to get the first pass to that point. Yeah, I just think when it sounds like something I'm not working on, that's when I know I think that this is ready to go.
To kind of bounce off that question there, in your mind, what ultimately makes a great mix?
It's funny. I don't notice great mixes. I only notice bad ones. In other words, it's true. I might notice that a mix is great on a song like the 5th or 6th time I've listened to it, but sometimes I'm just so into the tune that I'm not really noticing it. I think a great mix just has to, in other words, all the rules of lots of low end on the kick, this, I could play you something that is the opposite of that I love and can't stop listening to. You know what I mean? So it's if it has the vibe, and if you're not distracted by the sonics, then I think that it can work really. That sometimes a really good mix on a song doesn't serve the song the best. I've been a part of that, and I've seen that happen, where the rough mix had the energy. As flawed as it is, the rough mix had the energy, and that's what's important on this song, so that's what we're going to do on it. Now you've gone and refined the mix, and technically it sounds better, but in doing that, you've lost the energy. That happens, and so I just try to, I try not to think of any one thing. What I will say, that I think the one thing that separates the men from the boys, or the girls from the ladies, or however you want to put it, to me, what makes a great mix is when it goes from section to section and keeps your attention. That there's never a point, and that's also part of the production and arrangement is all in that, all works towards that. So in other words, when we get to the bridge, it needs to have a lift to it, because you got to keep the listener engaged. And when we get to the last chorus, there's going to be maybe the same backing vocals, but where there was 6 guys singing it, now there's going to be 12. You got to keep upping the ante. You got to make the song, you got to make it so the listener isn't checking their email by they get to the time that, they get to the second verse. And that's what I think makes great mixes, are mixes that you just keep listening to.
Yeah, it's kind of like that live sound adage of when it sounds good, everyone says oh, the band sounded amazing. When it sounds bad, it's the sound guy sucked. But when the band sounded good, maybe it was the sound guy making them sound good too, right? It's like that. You don't want something that's going to distract you and pull you away from the enjoyment of the music, right? So I think everything you said there just makes a lot of sense. Ken, this has been awesome. I've really enjoyed learning more about your process and your workflows and all that kind of stuff. If people want to learn more about you and maybe even work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I have a website, kensluiter.com. I'm on Instagram, Ken Sluiter. I'm on Facebook. So I'm easy to find. I'm around.
Awesome. We'll put those links in the show notes too, so people can easily access those too.
Fantastic. Appreciate that.
Awesome. Ken, again, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
So that was my interview with Ken Sluiter, and I really enjoyed that. I thought it was really interesting to learn about Ken's career path. And I love that he brought up that idea of being a little bit older in his 30s. I mean, I'm in my 40s now, so for me to say older in 30s being old, you're not. If you're in your 30s, you are not old. But when you're at that age, when you have kids, when you have people that depend on you, a family, kids, that kind of stuff, it can feel like if you're at that stage of your life, you need to make some big decisions. And I really like that Ken brought up that idea of just checking your ego at the door and realizing that, just because you're at a certain age, just because you have a wife and kids and family and whatever, it doesn't mean that you have to have it all figured out, and you also have to be able to spot those opportunities for growth. And sometimes, if your status is that, like in Ken's case, where he was an engineer already, that's a kind of that's the pinnacle of what we want, right? A lot of people want to be engineers. We want to be the main person or the producer or whatever. But sometimes realizing that there's a great opportunity if you are willing to take a step back, if you're willing to check your ego at the door and spot an opportunity for an opportunity, opportunity to grow, opportunity to connect with people and to build your network and build different credits under your belt. I think it's a really refreshing thing to hear, because I know I've certainly dealt with that in my own career as well. And there's been times where I'm like, I'm already at this level. Like, I can't go back a step. But like, you have these like mental gymnastics that you have to put yourself through. But when you're willing to just drop your ego at the door, sometimes the greatest opportunities come your way. And there's so much more growth and a faster speed of growth as well. So yeah, I just thought it was really cool to hear Ken talk about that. And for people who are even older, like 30s, 40s, whatever, it doesn't matter. At whatever age, like, it's important to recognize that the opportunities are there, and you just have to realize when something is worth taking and when something is a risk that maybe you shouldn't take. But yeah, I thought it was great to learn more about that from Ken. And I also really enjoyed learning more about his process, especially as it relates to things like setting up a mix, getting your balances right, how he focuses on translation, and the things that he's listening for when it comes to things like kick and bass relationships, and making sure that those elements work well with each other. I think that that's something that a lot of people struggle with. So it's kind of cool to hear, everything from his tricks on getting levels right to his EQ decisions. All that stuff comes together to really get you a lot of clarity. Even when it comes to the technical side of things, like dealing with clocking, I thought that was also a really interesting thing that I haven't heard anyone on the podcast talk about it like that, as far as how clocking actually plays a role in your process, and how sometimes working with a great clock might not actually give you a lot of advantage, especially if you're switching between interfaces or in different clocks and that kind of stuff. I thought he did a really good job of explaining what a clock is, because that's kind of a mysterious thing for a lot of people too. So it was definitely refreshing to learn more about his process there and understand more about why he likes to stay mixing in the box and some of the advantages of just keeping it simple, and I think that goes a long way. Sometimes simplicity is the easiest way to just get great results, and we don't have to get bogged down by tons of different decisions or processes or techniques or gear lust and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes the simplest way ends up being the best way. So yeah, I just really enjoyed that episode. I thought there was tons of great stuff from it. So hope you did as well, and you can take a lot of good stuff from this episode too. Now, if you're someone who is currently working on new music and you're struggling to get the sound that you hear in your head to come out of your speakers, if you're not sure of your own process and what that should look like as far as what to focus on, what to be listening for, how to use the tools, what settings to dial in, to ultimately get the sound that you hear in your head to come out of those speakers and to feel confident in your decisions and work fast and feel like you have a repeatable process for all of the other songs that you work on as well. If that sounds like you and you want some one-on-one help, that's exactly what I focus on inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. And in that program, I work one-on-one with my students to help make sure that your vision does come to life and that you do have that clear, repeatable process. You know what to be listening for, how to adjust your process and your settings to get that sound that you want and ultimately end up with something that you're proud of and excited about and ready to release, because that's what this is all about, right? No point in having songs just sitting on your hard drive. Let's get these songs out there. Let's let other people enjoy these songs too, right? So if you want one-on-one help with your tracks and you want someone to walk you through this process, give you feedback along the way, even help mix with you to get that sound to come out, definitely make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude. And on that page there, you'll find a link where you can book a call with me. I'd love to learn more about you and your processes, your goals, and to see how I can ultimately help. And if it seems like a good fit where I can help you, then I'd love to invite you into the program. I can tell you all about the course and what it looks like to be part of that. If you're not a good fit, don't worry, I'll let you know. I only work with people who I truly believe I can help. So once again, if you're interested in learning more, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit MasterYourMix.com.